Hey guys, this is where planes go to die. So I'm fortunate enough to spend a lot of time traveling on planes, and while I always enjoy that 45th trip over Kansas to wonder why there's so much flat corn everywhere, one of the questions that I've been thinking about a lot lately is how long does a plane last? And how old is the plane I'm traveling on? Commercial air travel has changed a lot since the glory days of the 1960s and 70s. I mean, come on. Doesn't this look wonderful? This is economy and it's like bigger than first class today. What's interesting though is that the planes themselves have largely remained the same. Take the Boeing 747, the first jumbo jet and one of the largest planes that still flies today, was actually originally launched back in 1970. So, you know, I wonder why they cram so many people in the planes these days. Oh, right, because they like making money. Got it. Today, big airlines typically keep their planes around for somewhere between 10 to 15 years. Now, sometimes they are retired after this, but usually there's a lot more lifespan in them, and they're then resold to other smaller carriers. Usually, planes are replaced for the same reason that you would upgrade your car. Sure, it might still work, but the newer model is not only going to be more fuel efficient, but also easier to maintain. For example, the older Boeing 747 uses 4 engines, whereas the newer 777 uses only 2. Now, it's not a complete apples to apples comparison, but as time goes on, planes get more fuel efficient and they get cheaper to manufacture and run. Actually, they're not cheaper to manufacture. They're cheaper for air carriers over long periods of time. They're all still wildly expensive. These days, planes also have longer lifespans. So the older Lockheed TriStars averaged about 24 years before they were retired, whereas the slightly newer 747s are averaging about 27 years, and a lot of more modern planes are actually scheduled for 30 years or even more. When a plane averages between 135 and 165,000 flight hours over the course of its life, you'd expect that the mileage is really a big contributing factor to when you need to retire a plane. But it actually isn't. The main reason why you need to retire a plane is because of the pressurization cycles. A pressure cycle occurs every time the plane takes off and then lands. What happens is because the interior of the plane is pressurized to a much lower altitude than the 30 to 40,000 feet that a lot of jets travel at, it puts a lot of stress on the fuselage and wings every time that you pressurize it, depressurize it, pressurize it, depressurize it. And the issue is that while a lot of components on a plane are easily fixed, you can't exactly, replace the entire wing or the entire fuselage without really just making it much more cost effective to buy an all new plane. This is especially apparent in planes that have a lot of short routes. So every time it takes off and lands, it's really sort of ticking down the clock. So even though a big jumbo jet like a 747 might last for decades, a 737 which takes off 20 times a day probably won't last anywhere near as long. When a plane is no longer in use, however, odds are it'll end up at the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base located in Tucson, Arizona, also known as the Boneyard. Was that dramatic enough? We're going to the boneyard. We might not know what we find at the boneyard. But I'm gonna totally ruin my voice if I keep talking like that. I know that for sure. This area was chosen for a few key reasons. First of all, Tucson is in the middle of the desert, which means that they only get around 11 inches of rain per year, and that coupled with the very low humidity of around 10 to 20% means it's an ideal location for making sure that the planes decay as slowly as possible. On top of that, the 4 square miles that is used for the storage facility is all hard dirt, which means that they didn't have to go and pave all of it over. They can just park their planes on the dirt and they'll be completely fine. Right now, there are roughly 4,400 planes parked at the boneyard with a combined value of about $32 billion. And it's a wide variety of planes that are here as well. Everything from commercial airliners all the way up to military jets, including B-52 nuclear bombers. Fun fact, those nuclear bombers actually have to be stored with their wings detached because of a nuclear treaty with Russia, which dictates that, the whole Cold War thing was bad, so let's make sure that all the bombers are separated from their wings so that everyone can see on Google Maps and make sure that there's no funny business going on. I just like the idea that Russians are checking out on Google Maps whether or not the Americans are welding their wings back on and just hey, are they still there? Yeah, Google Maps updated 3 years ago, it's fine, don't worry about it. Do you think the Russians really use Google Maps? These are all maintained by the 309th Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Group, which is comprised of 550 engineers and inspectors. Now, as you might expect, it is not cheap to store a plane. For example, if you have a 747 stored at the boneyard, it's going to cost you about $60,000 a month to keep it in working order. When a plane arrives at the boneyard, it goes through fairly extensive prep. Things like the tires are wrapped in Mylar to keep them from deteriorating in the sun, the fuel tanks are flushed out of any kind of fuel, and the actual exteriors are power washed to make sure that there's no salt or corrosives. And if it's a military plane, the weapons and the sensitive documents like building nuclear bomb instructions are all removed. I at least hope they're all removed. The weapons are definitely gone, right? They take those off? There's no like machine guns sitting out in the desert?
I don't think so.
Jets that haven't been harvested for parts go through fairly extensive maintenance 3 times a year to make sure they can fly on a moment's notice. The rest of the aircraft are minimally maintained for upcycling, a fancy way of saying that they're going to be stripped for parts. Now this actually is something that is incredibly common in the aircraft industry. When you consider that a single plane might be made up of 350,000 individual components, the majority of which are usable in other planes, there is a whole lot of scrapyard wars happening on that boneyard. You see what I did there with Scrapyard Wars?
I like that.
Except that it's not computers, it's planes. For context, a brand new 747 can cost up to $300 million. When you look at some of the other components that are upcycled, such as the engines, which cost about half the price of a brand new one, this practice can save the industry about $1 billion a year. When the sad day comes that a jet has been completely stripped of all usable parts, it is then recycled and turned into scrap. In the case of a 747, that $300 million plane is now worth about $55,000 of scrap aluminum, which is then recycled into all kinds of other products, including Coke cans. You ever wonder why Coke cans are actually shaped the way they are? Just totally random thought, but can we do a This Is episode on that?
Yeah, I think we can manage that.
Excellent. So next time you're on a flight and wonder how exactly old is the plane that I'm on right now, rest assured, it's probably safe, it's very likely full of lots of upcycled parts, and it almost certainly will end up at the boneyard one day. Hopefully after you get off the plane though, that would be bad.